How many were at the workshop this morning? There were Stephen and I am sure.
Gary was there.
Okay. Yeah, so some of you weren't. Okay, what happened was they took to a role play of using VSM to you were a council committee trying to work out what to do about policy, safety policy, in the light of things like Grenfell Tower and so on. And using VSM to actually think of what you can do. And 4 groups, they came up with some very interesting ideas. And 2 groups were given what are called aspects, and 2 groups weren't, just to see if there's a difference. Let me tell you a very brief story. I'm a committed Christian, but I'm also a Green activist. Joined the Green Party, stood for Parliament because of a book. I went to a conference where someone on Christians in politics, and they asked for recommendation of a book. I mentioned this book, and someone at the back was selling it. He took me for a copy afterwards and said, "Do you know the philosophy behind this book called Thine is the Kingdom?" And he explained what I'm going to explain to you now. There's a Dutch guy called Herman Dooyeweerd, 1894 to 1977, so he's kind of mid-20th century. And he took philosophy in a different way, rather than talking about entities or processes or various other things. He talked about meaning and put meaningfulness right at the basis of philosophy. Not meaningfulness. There's a lot of philosophy of meaning, a linguistic term and various others. Excuse me. But he was saying that meaningfulness is fundamental, that everything is meaning, whether we attribute it or signify it or not, which goes deeper than these other terms. Whence meaning? Why is it possible for us to attribute meaning or assign meaning or understand meaning in conversations and so on? And he that meaning is the being of all that is created, the nature even of our selfhood. So, out of Greek philosophy, there's the idea of being. Being is the most fundamental thing, and Kant said, "No is not a predicate." And just being, to which properties and attributes are kind of added, and meaning. Excuse me, I've got this cold, so I'm going to try to keep my distance. And the whole managed to keep going. Leibniz said, no, being is always a mode. It's not a being, something being, it's being as. So, it's a pen. It is a pen. What do we mean by it is a pen? Except by reference to the lingual aspect of possibility, of writing, of communicating. But it's also got a physical aspect of ink. It's also got a kinematic aspect of ink flowing. It wouldn't really be a good pen if ink didn't flow. But its main, if you like, its purpose, if you like, is always lingual. But it might also be a status symbol. I remember when I first met Stephen, he was most impressed that I was using these Lamy fountain pens. And I've always loved them, even though fairly cheap these days, but they're beautiful. And so there's a social aspect, and I find them beautiful, an aesthetic aspect. So there's some examples. I mentioned different aspects on the pen. And so I'm going to take you through this. On the back is a sheet of aspect, or reference. And on the front is what I'm going to take you through. Philosophically, Dooyeweerd's focus on putting meaningfulness as a foundation means that you can get ontology being, or epistemology, how we know, axiology, norms, and what's right and wrong, good and bad, and so on, all integrated together. whereas in traditional philosophy there's an is or fact value divide. Doivit enables us to integrate them. But I'm not here to talk philosophy. But because he treated meaning as something fundamental rather than accidental, he was free to ask, in what ways can things be meaningful? He was free to ask an ontological question about meaning. And over a period of about 30 years, and in his magnum opus, which I actually brought along, in his magnum opus, which there's actually 2 volumes of this. He spent about a quarter of it developing and arguing for these aspects, or showing how he came up with these aspects, which are 15. I'll go through them on the back in a minute, but have a look at the picture. I like to think his idea of meaning is that meaning is like the ocean that fish swim in. The ocean enables them to be fish. It enables them to swim, but they're not aware of it. You know, as the old fish say to the young fish, how's the water? And the young fish said, what is water? We and everything else in the universe exists in an ocean of meaningfulness, is able to exist and is able to be and function. You might think, oh, what about physical meaning? Well, think about the smallest atom in the furthest star, in the furthest galaxy away from us, that humans will never have anything to do with. Still, that atom is meaningful, at least in the physical way of meaning, and kinematic and a few others, and it functions in those. But Doivit wasn't content with just. Well, let's go over to the back. I'll just run you through his 15 aspects. The first 3 are mathematical aspects. These are ways in which things can be meaningful and in which we can think of them as meaningful. The word aspect comes from architecture, like the east aspect of a building or the south aspect of a building. And they're different, irreducible to each other. And they are ways of seeing the building. So they've got a subject seeing them, but they're not purely subjective. They are something to do with the building itself, regardless of who sees it. And the same with reality, that's what Doivit was saying. So everything functions in the quantitative aspect, spatially and kinematically, to do with movement. And then the physical, everything that's physical functions in the physical aspect, to do with energy and mass and fields and forces and causality and so on. And then there's the biotic aspect, which is to do with life functions, or if you like, it's the what's the word? Integrity of the organism separated from but within its environment, and all these. Oh, what's the word? Homeostasis. Is that right? The right word? No. Or self-regulation. Doivit spent a lot of time thinking about all the different aspects and how do you define them, and on the left it's kind of what he calls a kernel meaning, which can never be fully identified or expressed in language, but you can get fairly close. And if you like these words, you can use them to triangulate. And an important thing that Doivit says is that we can understand and grasp the kernel meanings of each aspect better with intuition than with analysis of theoretical thought definition. So it's great for everyday life. We'll come to that in a minute. Take what we're doing now. There is a numerical aspect, there's a spatial aspect we're arranged, there's a kinematic aspect of moving around or our thoughts moving. And then there's a physical aspect in that the air is carrying vibrations of sound and letting us see each other and so on and so forth. Biotic aspect is when anyone here dead? No, but you're not.
Not yet.
Not yet. Soon will be. This conversation must require people to be alive, and sensory aspects to sense and respond. And there's emotion in there, so basic animal kind of emotions like fear and hunger, and feeling you need to go to the loo and things like that. But we don't stop that anymore. Then there's the analytical aspect, which is distinction, making distinctions and conceptualizing. And if I ask you to listen, what do you get? Fair. And various other things. You probably weren't very aware of that before I asked. But in your sensory functioning, you were hearing it. But in your analytical functioning, you were hopefully focusing on what I was saying. Then there's the formative aspect, which is to do with human formative power. So achieving things, making things, designing, planning, and so on. So whereas an analytic aspect, if you like, is analysis and breaking down, formative is constructive and building up. Then there's the lingual aspect, which is expressing things, bits of meaning in symbols, words or shrugs or boundary stones or writing diagrams or whatever. Then there's the social aspect, which is not just interaction between individuals, but treating us as a we together. And institutions, roles, and things are meaningful in that. Then there's the economic aspect, which is not to do with wealth and productivity and production and consumption and so on. It's to do with respecting things as a resource with value, and therefore being frugal with them, careful. So it's to do with frugality, Doyen says. Then there's the aesthetic aspect, to do with, Doyen says, harmony. So it's not just art, but it includes art, leisure, sports, and all these things. But it's to do with harmony, as in an orchestra. It's but it's also to do with the mood of enjoyment and fun and humour. Humour is, if you like, a little bit of disharmony, but is harmonious disharmony, if that makes sense. Then there's a juridical aspect, which is to do with what is due, justice, righteousness, appropriateness. And Doyeviers argues that is post-aesthetic, because what is really just must be just here as well as there, all over the system, all over the nation or whatever it is, if it's to be true justice. So it requires the aesthetic. By the way, I've just given you an example of inter-aspect dependency. Each of the later aspects depends foundationally on the others. So the social depends on the lingual, for example. You wouldn't get much social activity without there being communication, for example. But the lingual depends on the social for bringing it to full meaning. If you were just on your own, you could write things down as a memory, but it doesn't give the full richness of the lingual. The juridical is then succeeded by the ethical, which is to do with goodness, going beyond what is due, to things like mercy, forgiveness, generosity, openness, if you like, it's self-giving love, or in the Greek New Testament, agape love. That is love which is self-sacrificing. And to the juridical aspect, that doesn't make sense. Then there's the faith aspect, which is the pistic, from Greek pistis, pistin, meaning what we really believe, not what we say we believe. So it's not to do with doctrine, it's to do with what we really believe, what we really assume, presuppose, aspire to, expect, commit to. And it goes from tiny things like, did anyone test their chair before they sat on it? you just sat down, assuming it was going to take your weight, right up to religious martyrs who die for what they believe. So, what Doyle is saying, and he's not claiming this is any final truth, but it's his best guess, and I have found it stands the test of time. And I find it useful as a conceptual tool to do 4 things. I'll come back to the diagram in a minute, but it helps us to separate things out. This is in the complexity of everyday life. It helps, as I've been doing. It helps us to understand things more deeply and listen more attentively. What I find is, for example, John Walker and I were talking about regeneration. And I said, well, what's the difference between regeneration and generation? They said, oh, there's lots of debate about that. What's the meaning of that re? Re, and do you express something? Now, because I had aspects of background in my mind, re was to generation takes something and generates. Regeneration has respect for what is already there and has been destroyed and needs to be put back there again. So that's the meaning of the re. And I didn't, in the front of my mind, use aspects, but in the back of my mind, I thought, which aspect or aspects is that re meaningful? And that was going on in the back of my mind, and I was able to probe, and we were able to think things out more deeply. The third thing, it helps us see what is missing. When I introduced aspects to Stephen first, he was in business meetings, and he found them useful to say, well, we've discussed this economic aspect, we've discussed this aspect, but we haven't discussed this aspect. And so he could introduce it. And it's very useful to use this as a checklist. Tick, 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 tick. Ah, there's something missing. You know, very often the ethical aspect is missing. Often what we call business ethics is actually juridical. But the idea of attitude, of selflessness, voluntariness, especially in Marxist inspired communities. And finally, it offers guidance, because each aspect is not just an aspect, it's good. It offers a good. It offers a way in which things work well. As I said right at the beginning, if I could take sustainability as functioning well in all these aspects and all the different parts. Did I mention the Green Party thing? Yeah. You know, each emphasising a different aspect, but if we got everything, so we can define sustainability normatively in terms of good and evil. Finally, the bottom of the page, and I'll come back to this. Oh no, let me take the diagram. The diagram is of people having breakfast and seeing the aspects of that everyday life event. So there are a couple of labels. There's a conversation of people at breakfast, and also I like to listen to the radio. There's the ethical aspect of offering the last piece of toast to somebody else rather than taking it for yourself. There's the biotic aspect, there's the main one. The reason for breakfast is sustenance, and so on and so forth. We operate, everything goes on in this ocean of meaningfulness. So therefore, all situations, complex situations, I see as exhibiting being possible and functioning in this ocean of meaning. But also, VSM itself is an expression of the ocean of the various aspects. And so, as a quick exercise, I went down the 5 subsystems, and I thought, which aspect is this most meaningful? So S4, sorry, the information channels is obviously the lingual. S3 is management, which is mainly formative and economic, formative of achieving things, and maybe something to do with juridical, what what it is right to achieve. Adapting to the environment and there's a lot to do with aesthetic there, and also an analogy of the biotic aspect of organisms adapting to their environment. And then S5, steering and overall steering, especially, is governed by the fistic aspect of what is this system about. That's the way I see it. Do you see it differently? Those who, first of all, it's a very quick brush through, and I'm glad I'm not going to have to talk much more because my throat's giving out. But any questions for us?
I've met Andrew in 2001. And since then, I was exposed to this at university a decade before that. And since then, I've been thinking and reading this and had PhD students doing it and studied a lot of other philosophy. And I can say that I'm also a devoted Christian, but you don't need to be a devoted Christian to adopt these aspects. And I've seen many people not being a devoted Christian. But what Andrew said today is this idea of the ethical aspect in Doevier being different from business ethics, which is morely juridical. That actually is something I'm going to take home. And what Andrew says is these aspects helps you to ask the right questions. It's amazing how in the back of our minds, when we know these aspects, how they help us to formulate questions. And what Andrew, I don't know if you've said it, Andrew, but everything has a specific aspect, like your pen has a formative, let me not use the right terminology here, can be distinguished in a specific aspect, that it is overriding aspect. And that to me is one of the parts of Doevier that really, really assisted me to say, what is the normative aspect of a hospital? What is the main purpose of a hospital? And any entity, one can ask that question, what is the overriding aspect or the most important aspect of that entity? And that guides me a lot in the systems approach.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I don't know if it's a question or an observation. I've come across, like in the design space, the idea of looking for qualities,
Okay.
and then trying to see how to balance the conflicts in any design process to achieving high scores in the qualities that you're after, whether it's sustainability, resilience, robustness, efficiency. These are kind of qualities in tension, but they're very useful in helping to see what the trade-offs are. Now, this is obviously an issue of trade-offs. They're cumulative, but nonetheless, it's still a framework within which you can tease out aspects of a thing, a design process or whatever. And the other thought occurs to me when I said the word meaning. Oh, semantics, levels of, and as soon as I said that to myself, I'm thinking, oh, I wonder how this relates to large language models, where that's effectively developing semantic relationships in semantic spacing, embeddings. I was beginning to wonder, therefore, whether there's something there where, for example, if you were to look at these aspects and ask in semantic embeddings within a large language model, do you find them in some way, in some relationship? Are there some kind of causal connectivity that is cumulative, as you just illustrated? It's analogical thinking, I'm sure, or metaphorical thinking. I don't know which, but does that resonate with you?
Yes, in fact, you said several things that resonate. Right. The analogical, first of all, there's an interactive. There are several inter-aspect relationships. One is interactive aspect dependency, the functioning of an aspect depends on good functioning in earlier aspects, and in later aspects was good full meaning. But there's an analogical interaspect analogy. So, for example, causality is physical, but there's something very intuitively like causality in logic between concept of antecedents and consequent, for example, and in inference. And I used to work in artificial intelligence, the old type, in inference nets, and I found myself continually confusing between actual causality and inference. For example, large language models, yes. If you think in terms of old-fashioned inference nets, does anyone know what I mean by an inference net? You know, where you have concepts linked by relationships that are inference. Well, the concept, the boxes and arrows, if you like, are the structure. What leads to what? But what does it mean is the lingual aspect. So there's the formative aspect and the lingual aspect. The analytical aspect is actually the separating out of concepts. So a good knowledge engineer would actually take a concept and think, is this a pure concept, or is it a combination of a couple of concepts that need to be teased apart, things like that. So there's the analytical aspect. But the lingual aspect is its meaning, its semantic meaning. And so large language models is a bit like that, writ large and writ randomly as well, because they're randomly generated rather than from human knowledge, neural nets. And it's not that each neuron in the neural net, each cell in the neural net is a concept, no, because they operate more at an analogy of the psychical sensory aspect. And if you think in terms of computer system models, has anyone heard of Alan Newell, the knowledge level? He said there's different systems models. So if you like, there's the silicon, copper or silicon physical level. Then there's the component level, electronics, which I see as a bit like an analogy of the biotic level. And then there's the, I think it's a signal level, which is separating out yeses and nos, noughts and ones, which is, if you like, the could be the analytical distinction. And then there's the structural level of what you call the information, which is the formative aspect. And then the meaning of the knowledge, which is the meaning of this, which is the lingual. And then there was a social as well, as some people said. And I was surprised at how closely, not identically, it follows Goyam's aspects. I refused to rush to identify the levels with aspects because I wanted to think about it. I took some years to do so, but there's certainly a parallel with systems levels and these aspects. But the thing is, Goyam gives us the human, often the human and post-social aspects as well, and separates them out.
I wanted to ask about congruence between the levels.
Congruence, right? What do you mean?
Well, I don't know if I have this the way that you have this. I'm not an academic. All of the work that I've been doing in systems has been very, very practical.
Very good.
One of the things I look for is fractals. So is the spatial way, so for example, spatially this is incongruent with the methodology that most of the presentations have been in, because I can't, they all go like this, so they're not bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so there's a spatial incongruence sometimes with what's being talked about at the front.
You mean here and now?
Here in this conference.
Oh,
yeah.
the whole any talk, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And so I noticed when the meaning of the way that we are sitting is congruent or incongruent with what we might like to have happen at the analytical level, or what we might like to have, how we want to make meaning. Okay. So I just wondered whether when you're doing this, one of the things I look for is, should the way that, are we looking for congruence at the different levels so that they are aligned So the A is more likely to get us, the way that we're spatially organised is more likely to get us.
Give me an example of a spatial arrangement
So
not suiting the analytical. What do you mean?
So if I
Give
give
me
you
an
an
example.
example, so when we're working with the long-term unemployed and we're organising the building,
Mhm.
so if there's a coffee machine here
Yes.
for the long-term unemployed to come in and use, but these two managers in their own office have and that is against what they say they want, which is to recreate a long-term unemployed company in which we are egalitarian and everyone's treated equally, because we believe that people are equal. But
Okay.
then I'll go, well, I'll tell you what, you see this, that's incongruent with this, and so the meta message of the system, everyone will still know that you don't really believe it. So if you really believe it, if that meaning, the meaning has to be all the way through the system, it has to be in the structure, as well as the behaviour, as well as the language used, as well as what you call people, it all has to line up. Otherwise the meta message is it's not true and we don't believe it. That's what I mean.
Right. Well, thank you, especially for that example. I think there's probably several things going on there. If I would analyse it like this. Well, first of all, yes, congruence among the aspects. No aspect can be derived from another, so there's irreducibility. So you can't say that if things work well biotically, then they're going to work well sensorily, because plants don't feel and so on. Also, an animal sensing can have a disease and can still sense. So there's a kind of irreducibility. We can function in each aspect, regardless of how badly things are functioning in other aspects. So even very impoverished people can strongly believe, for example. You don't have to be rich to have aesthetics in life and then justice and love and believe. You can love and believe even though you're poor, for example. Unless that's relevant to what I've just said. No. Okay, keep it. I want to go back to congruence. But there's an incongruence in your example, because what the management says and what it does is often hypocritical. In fact, not to the management, aren't we all hypocritical sometimes? And sometimes, we're forced to do it. Sometimes we do it deliberately out of cynicism, but sometimes we don't even realise what's happened. If you put yourself into the manager's shoes and say, why have they got their own coffee machine? Why might that be? Now, cynically, because they're selfish and they're not really egalitarian and so on. But are there any other reasons? Might they have their own coffee machine? Is it for visitors? They have to host visitors or something?
It actually can be a good thing, because they can have coffee without making the others feel that having coffee, that they are being checked on by the managers.
Yeah, another one. So there might be reasons why they've done it, so we shouldn't rush to judge too much. I mean, rushing to judge too much is juridically correct, but ethically poor, in that we are not being merciful to them. But we can recognise that they themselves might be being selfish, i.e. ethically dysfunctional. See? So if we separate this helps us, me at least, to separate things out and think what's really going on here, and to try to understand the other empathetically rather than just rush to judgment.
Can I offer something? So,
Is it relevant?
yes,
To this?
yes,
Because otherwise you're second in the queue.
So I think the answer to your question is very much yes. It's something that Andrew hasn't touched on yet. Because the aspects are sovereign, the way it's described, so they're irreducible, right? But they all rely on each other for their full expression of their meaning. Which means that if you take, in the case of that company, which is obviously an effort to get people who are long-term employed to be working together, right? And so it's probably ethically qualified in that it's a loving thing to do, and it's probably juridically qualified in that it's the right thing to do. So you've got this mix. So now within the context of that, right, all of the other aspects still function. So the spatial aspect functions within that context. So the space isn't reflecting those juridical principles, so it's wrong. Right? Does that mean? So in other words, it's not supporting that. So yeah, it jars. It jars. And so you can then say, okay, well, if we are working in this context here, we've got this meaning. How should the space reflect it? Another one that I think.
So what we do here is probably to follow Andrew's thing is we use clean language, which means we accept and extend and model out the discrepancies. And then what they realised, the discrepancies then highlighted a lack of trust that they didn't realise that they had of leaving hot liquids free to. And so what they did do is to redesign the building so that everybody had access to fresh coffee.
Okay.
So that is what they did, but that we use the discrepancies to highlight that incongruencies, to highlight hidden.
Yeah, incongruences and discrepancies and wrongs and so on, whatever you like to call them, different types, are very useful to highlight the things and how things ought to be changed.
Another very simple example is if you are trying to get collaboration of the meaning, let's say you want to have a collaborative group, so it's that social aesthetic balance of social functioning, right? And you try and do it in a group and laid out like this, it's really not going to work. Right? But if it's in a ring shape, then it's obviously going to work better. If you're giving a lecture, right, where it's a different meaning, this is better than that. So I'm trying to find ways of explaining it. Yes, 100%. These things do they all relate to each other all the time, unavoidably, and you can think about it iteratively to as deep a depth as you wish.
Okay, thanks.
Can we take the question because we still have like 5 minutes?
Oh, is that all? Okay.
Right. So, yeah, it's really interesting. I find it a very useful checklist, and I know you didn't want to talk philosophy, but one can't ignore the fact that you're looking at a philosopher and his thoughts. And you're looking at what philosophers have done since Aristotle, which is try to categorize the world.
Yep.
And you go Aristotle, Kant, they've all tried to create categories for the world.
Yep.
So I think in terms of scholarship, it's necessary to compare it to something else,
Yes.
because that's what it's doing in many ways in itself. So to compare it to something else, I have 2 areas. One is the theory of concepts. So theory, prototypicality, and exemplars.
Okay.
Where do concepts come from? Because all of these are concepts.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So where are they coming from? And the second one, which I use all the time, is Laws of Form by Spencer Brown, which says that meaning comes from a distinction.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very powerful because it actually says that you can take that distinction and make a re-entry into yourself. I won't go into, people find that to be magic, but it's incredibly powerful when you make a re-entry into itself. But what Spencer Brown, or rather Lerman from Spencer Brown, says is that everything is a paradox. So
Yes.
when you were talking earlier, okay, about hypocritical, everything is hypocritical because it's part of a paradox. Okay, because making a distinction. So
why is it? Tell me, why is everything a paradox?
because a distinction in itself is already a paradox.
Why? What's paradoxical?
Okay,
I mean, I'm happy to believe.
let me just
But can you explain in one sentence?
what's a decision?
A decision.
It's better.
So what's
What's a
that?
decision? Is it? Would you say it's planning for the future, or taking an action to plan for the future? So hang on a minute. Are we trying to decide what a decision is? And there's the paradox.
Yeah. We've got to-
more.
There we go.
Okay,
Okay, so you're in a paradox already.
let me read the first half page of Doyerbeard's New Critique of Theoretical Thought, which I think addresses what this is. Introduction: the first way of a transcendental critique of philosophical thought.
Coming from Kant.
Yeah, he owes a lot to Kant, and he refers to Kant a lot, discusses him and critiques him, also Aristotle, and a lot of philosophies. He did, and he didn't jump over the medieval period like a lot of history of philosophy people went through as well. So, if I consider reality as it is given in the naive pre-theoretical experience, naive being, we're not thinking about it, we're just accepting it, we're just living it, okay? If I consider reality as it is given in the naive pre-theoretical experience, and then confront it with a theoretical analysis, which is the distinction making. So first, without just living it, and then confront it with distinction making, through which reality appears to split up into various modal aspects.
Hang on, where's that come from?
This is him.
Yeah, but where's it come from?
This
He just says it appears.
that's right.
He's
This-
sticking a word into there, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
That's his perception.
But there's a little footnote, number one.
Okay.
Here are meant the fundamental, so here are meant fundamental universal modalities of temporal being, which do not refer to the concrete what of things, but are only the different modes of the universal how, which determine the aspects, blah, blah, blah. Now, this is not, what he's doing in the first few pages of this, he's setting out his main thesis.
Yeah.
But
He's making a
he's going to
series of-
argue it later.
He's making a series of some assumptions. I don't want to get
Yes,
too
he
much into that, but what he's doing is constraining you to this line of thought. So if I take, for instance, Spencer Brown,
Yeah.
I can use Spencer Brown to analyse the Mona Lisa.
Oh, well, hold
In
on,
great-
let me continue reading. Then the first thing that strikes me is the original indissoluble interrelation among these aspects, which are for the first time explicitly distinguished in the theoretical attitude of mind. An indissoluble relation in a coherence, it binds and so on.
But the words there were what strikes me. It's his perception.
It is.
Okay. So Spencer Brown makes it very clear that perception, you can't make a distinction unless you can make a perception. You
Yeah,
want
okay,
that,
fair enough.
So, for instance, a dog sees the world very differently because it can see the whole history in the street because of the smells. A dolphin can see inside its mate. It can see when its mate's got a tumour or something. It doesn't have to ask its mate if it's well because it can see inside through sonar. A seagull can see the difference between a piece of plastic that looks like bread and a piece of bread because it can see the ultraviolet coming off it.
Hang on, you're
Right, okay. We're all
I'm getting hot.
We're not really good. This is a VSM conference, not a philosophy conference.
So I have,
But we continue afterwards.
yeah,
Okay.
happy to continue this. Just like few words after, because like Andrew says in VSM, the idea to introduce this. So we're talking about how S4 sees the world. This is not addressed by VSM. How S5 should or sees the world.
Yeah.
And this is part of what happened in the workshop. So we gave this conference situation, and you can find that different S5s will see the world differently,
Yeah, yeah.
although VSM gives them the same instruction. And this happened in reality. For example, some people might prefer ethical aspects over. Some people will have self-preservation if they want to keep their job if they have high pay. And they will be influenced by that. So it's just examples. What the reason of introducing these aspects into VSM is to see the potential of using these first in designing, or not designing, but informing VSM on how the aspects should prioritize some of these aspects. Or in the other way, if you're a user of VSM, then if you're doing a diagnosis, how would you see the all three of these aspects? Or how can you influence a workshop and highlight points where people don't see? And you can say, have you considered this aspect? Yes.
May I have a quick observation?
Yeah, okay.
Not to be the AI nerd in the room, but what you just described is a system prompt. In other words, I want you
Yes.
to focus on this. I'm going to influence you by this particular set of preconditioning. Now, go on to the question, please.
Well, it's not, yeah, okay. It's not that narrow. So we're not going, you know, it's,
Analogous thing.
yeah. But in many cases, you are bounded by a boundary. So either time or resources or something. And sometimes it's just highlighting a blind spot. So you're not influencing them to focus only on that. You can offer them spectrum things.
Or bounded rationality.
Okay, yeah.
What is it doing?
Yeah, just from the brain to say these are not the only things that you need to think of. There's other things. Is that Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.